The story of Henry's boots. I'm Antony Lishak, a children's author, and here's one of my books, Henry's Boots. It's all about the way the life of a boy who was a useless football player was transformed by a special pair of football boots. Boots with a history, boots with a story to tell. And this is the story of that book. I suppose it all started 10 months before I was born. You see, I was born in December 1958, and 10 months earlier, in the February of that year, a terrible tragedy occurred. The Munich air crash, where the Busby Babes, Manchester United's legendary young team, were returning from a European Cup game against Red Star Belgrade. As a result of this tragedy, 23 people lost their lives, including 8 of the players, one of which was the great Duncan Edwards. By the age of 21, Duncan Edwards had become a regular in the United first team. He'd already played 18 times for England, scoring 5 goals. This is a picture of him signing an autograph a few minutes before what was to become the final game he played in England, 5 days before the crash. It was against Arsenal, which is where my story comes in. All my family are ardent Arsenal supporters, and it's all down to this man, my grandpa Marky. He was at that game back in 1958. This is a copy of the match programme. On that day, he watched Duncan Edwards score the final goal of his career. It was a rocket of a shot, he told me. He was practically standing on the centre circle. If it hadn't have been for the back of the net, the ball would have flown out of the stadium. Although I came from a fanatically ardent Arsenal family, and I was too young to have remembered the Munich air crash, the story of the Busby Babes and Duncan Edwards was an important part of my childhood. Let's fast forward to the 30th of July 1966. I was almost 8. The whole family were dancing around the front room after watching England win the World Cup. I was next to my grandfather when Bobby Moore, the England captain, lifted the trophy. "You know what?" he said. "If it hadn't have been for the Munich air crash, that would have been Duncan Edwards." And he's probably right. Lots of people who know far more about football than I do have said that. I remember thinking how sad it was that a terrible twist of fate has stopped that from happening. I didn't know it then, but the story of Henry's Boots was starting to grow in my head. Now, after 1966, football became even more popular than it was before, and this was reflected in comics. I loved comics, and apart from comedy comics like the Beano and Dandy, most comics for boys of my age were all about war. And I remember reading a comic called The Scorcher, where the comic strip Billy's Boots was first published. I loved it. It was all about a useless footballer who became a brilliant player because of a pair of magic boots. It mirrored my childhood fantasies perfectly. So you can see how the story of this book is starting to grow. Well, like Billy in the comic and Henry in my book, I was a useless football player. I must have broken hundreds of windows with my slice shots. We had a conservatory that was almost completely patched up with cardboard. Now, at that time, I loved reading and I loved writing, but I had no idea that I was going to become an author. Now, let's move on a few years. I'd never stopped writing stories, and I was lucky enough to get them published. I've always tried to use my own experiences as a starting point to a book, and I decided to write about my uselessness as a football player. I wanted to write my own version of the Billy's Boot story, and I suddenly realised I could use the story of Duncan Edwards, the story I had known for practically all of my life. I didn't try to write a life story. I wanted to write something that paid tribute to his memory, so I decided to do some more research into his life. I visited a place called Dudley, which is the town in the Midlands that he came from, and I was amazed to find that there was a statue of the great man in the town centre. There was also a Duncan Edwards pub. I even found a road named after him as well. I visited the church where there was a stained glass window made in his honour, and I went to see his grave. As I was taking a picture, a man came up to me and started a conversation. He said that every time Manchester United played a team in the area, there was always a coachload of supporters that came to that cemetery to pay their respects. United had played Aston Villa a week earlier, and sure enough, there was a card and some flowers there from the United Supporters Club. I wanted to call the old player whose boots Henry wears in the book Edward Duncan's. I thought that would be clever, but after my visit to Dudley, I realised that just wouldn't have been appropriate. Too many people still think so highly of him, and playing with his name like that would have been an insult to his memory. So I changed the player's name to Davy Evans, D.E. I used Duncan Edwards' initials instead, and I put an author's notes page in the back of the book to explain some of this. So that's the story of Henry's Boots. I was never very good at playing football, but in a way I became a superstar in Henry's Boots. I've always believed this, and it's a great thing for all aspiring young authors to believe. You can make your dreams come true in a story.